Yeah, hit me up. Oh, first off, like, what's your name? What can I call you by?
Greg. You can call me
Greg,
Greg.
nice to meet you. I'm Naomi, and yeah, let's get into it. What do you want to talk about?
So, maybe a good place to start is I posted a TikTok the other day that kind of went a little viral, and it had to do with trans stuff. And essentially, it was, and this kind of touches on the topics, obviously. But the I was kind of impersonating a progressive person and saying,
Okay.
"Hey, trans people are statistically more likely to unalive themselves." Right?
Hmm.
And then somebody says, "Well, should we not be more cautious then about promoting this ideology to children?" And then the progressive like freaks out at them and says like, "No, how dare you say that?" And yeah, I guess that's not really a specific one on your list, but I guess like, you know,
So if I'm
what do you think
understanding
of
you
that?
correctly, are you of the position that you are concerned about, say, younger people learning about trans people, or say that like that the social acceptance of trans people is encouraged simply because they have higher unaliving rates?
I think I'm well. Let's stick with one kind of fact or one kind of statistic at a time, so we don't kind of so we're on the same page here.
Sure.
Is this like a true thing that uh, trans people are do more likely unalive themselves? Like, is that a real thing?
Yes, that is a real statistic. Do you know why that statistic is the case? Like, why is it that trans people are more likely to, face that kind of harm? Okay, it connected again. Yeah, so I was asking, why do you think it is that trans people have these higher unaliving rates?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just kind of look at it in general, like, people unaliving themselves obviously isn't good. There could be a plethora of reasons why they might do that. Mental illness is obviously a big reason why that like overlaps into why people would unalive themselves. And I think we would kind of be not doing the debate or conversation justice if we didn't bring up um, what's it called? Body dysmorphia, as that's kind of like a mental sort of condition that's related to transgenderism, is it not?
No, I think you might be thinking of gender dysphoria, which is a very different condition than body dysmorphia. But overwhelmingly, these unaliving rates are actually due to social ostracization. We have the statistics which show that when a trans person has just strong support from a single family member, that unaliving rate drops to less than 1/17th of what it is in the general trans population. And we even have studies which show that when trans people are fully accepted and supported for who they are, their mental health outcomes and unaliving rates are closely in line with other cisgender people of their same age and demographics.
Okay. So that sounds great. And I'm guessing is this like a sort of collection of studies, or is it just
Yes,
one study,
I
or
do have a
is it
couple
like
of studies on this. Let me see if
okay.
I can find those right here. Where was it was the one about unaliving rates in particular. I've got to figure out where it
Yeah.
is in
So
my research doc.
yeah, no, it's okay. So
I know the one
I'm
about the one about closely matching cisgender people. This was oh yeah, children who are able to socially transition report levels of depression and anxiety which closely match levels reported by cisgender children. So these would be like kids that they're able to come out and socially transition, meaning they would be accepted by their parents and able to do so. And then as far as the unaliving rates,
So sorry. There was a
um,
study though, just so we don't move too fast here. There was a study that says that children who transition are just as happy as cis people. Like there's no
yes.
difference.
Hmm. That is the study that I was referencing.
Okay. So I want to go back to the thing you said earlier, that this study saying that essentially they are not they don't have thoughts of self-harm if there is like acceptance by one family member, you said, or something like
Yes.
that. So I guess what comes to mind is like, you know, you've heard of the term like unconditional love, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it sucks when you can't get unconditional love from a family member. Like absolutely, that's definitely not something that's good for someone's mental health or well-being. And I guess what's scary about that statistic, because you're kind of framing it as like a good thing of like, oh no, you just need validation from like your family members and then you'll be fine. But it's like now with this group of people, it's like whether you feel like living or not is conditional on another family member. And like now it's conditional on somebody else's opinion of you or validation of you. And I'm not trying to
It's not
like
necessarily contingent on an opinion, more so as it's contingent on, having the support and acceptance of your family. I mean, I think that tends to be pretty true of people in general. I mean, we saw similarly high unaliving rates, decades ago, back when like being gay was ostracized to the extent that being trans is ostracized today.
Mhm.
Tends to be a general social trend where when a marginal group is ostracized in such a way that they are, often denied who they are by their families, they have really bad mental health outcomes and, you know, high unaliving rates,
Mhm.
mostly in particular within those families that don't accept them. I also did find the source on the one about the unaliving rates dropped to 1/17th when they are supported. That was a report done by TransPulse, based on a survey of of 433 trans participants, including youth and adults.
Mhm. Okay, so I don't want to be like I don't want to be like too generic with this point, but it's kind of, is it not kind of safe to say that, not having your loved ones or your family members accept you in general or love you is like probably not good for your mental health and will probably, increase the chances of unaliving just in general, regardless of if you're trans
Oh,
or
in
not.
general, I would absolutely say that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, I want to talk about because the TikTok I made kind of I did a sort of reply to a comment where the commenter said, um, it's basically that it's not a choice, trans children, it's not a choice, they are who they are, and it's like there's absolutely nothing wrong with teaching kids about transgenderism. And my
Hmm.
response to that was, if that's the case, then why is there like a growing trend of detransitioning? Like, why is that a thing at all?
Where are you seeing this growing trend? Because whenever I look at the data, I find that detransitioners are exceptionally rare, and they always have been exceptionally rare.
So you don't think there's been any sort of uptick in detransitioning at all?
I mean, maybe on like an absolute sense, and because like whenever we have more people that are transitioning as a whole, more people on a whole will end up detransitioning. But in terms of like percentage wise, it's always been very, very small, and it still is very small today. The studies which I've seen on detransitioner, it tends to estimate that it's only between 1 to 2% of people who ever transition. The highest number I've ever seen was 8%. But that study in particular, what it found was that the vast, vast majority of those detransitioners were due to external factors, not internal factors, as in things like they couldn't afford their hormones, as in things like people didn't support or accept them. And it was not it was overwhelmingly not the case that they detransitioned because it wasn't right for them. In fact, if I have that, let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, here is the study. Yeah, only 5% of the detransitioners gave "it wasn't right for me" as any of the reasons for why they detransitioned.
Interesting. I've seen stats as high as 43%.
Wait, are you talking about persistence desistance studies?
Uh, Sorry, I didn't catch that. Like,
What's your source on that 43% number? Because if it's persistence desistance studies, you're interpreting those incorrectly.
so could you explain that to me? I don't know what
Yeah,
persistent,
so
desistent.
there was a collection of studies that are talking about persistence desistance of trans people, which is essentially they looked at everybody who was referred to a gender clinic, and then years later they assessed whether or not they were like a person who is a trans person and living, having transitioned. Now, why this is so easy to misinterpret is because everybody that is referred to a gender clinic is going to be primarily gender nonconforming people, people that are just like kind of struggling to figure out who they are. And a lot of these gender nonconforming kids that go through gender therapy are like, oh, I'm just gender nonconforming, and that's cool. And these kinds of studies would label them as D-sisters, or the types of people that which you are interpreting as detransitioners, when they're not detransitioners at all, because these are people that never transitioned. They were just gender nonconforming people that got some gender therapy.
Okay. And did these people go back to being cis or?
So these people that we're talking about, they were never trans. They were just gender nonconforming, and they stayed cis the entire time.
Okay. Yeah, I personally haven't done a deep dive on these specific studies. I've just kind of seen like the headline of each one of saying, oh, this is 43%, that's 8%. But yeah, I guess I
Yeah,
mean,
it's really unfortunate that the persistence desistance studies are heavily misinterpreted in a lot of circles, because they're really not assessing, like, whether or not people who transition remain in that trans identity. What they're assessing is, out of people that are referred to gender clinics, that are referred to gender therapy, what's their final outcome? Are they gender nonconforming cis people? Are they
mhm,
trans people? And what we find from these studies actually is that most people that receive gender therapy, and most people that are referred to these kind of gender clinics, aren't trans. And the clinics are actually pretty good at finding out, oh, hey, there's actually a lot of just gender nonconforming people, and they're
mhm.
happy being gender nonconforming.
Okay. So speaking of like, knowing if you're like a young person and you think you're trans, like how sophisticated is that process? Because like not to be crude, but like younger and younger kids are quote unquote coming out as trans. And even here in Canada, I believe they have this sort of like educational tool that's like a gingerbread person. And the gingerbread person can like change their genitalia. And the thing is, it's like gingerbread, Santa Claus, like, kids also believe in Santa Claus. And it's like they actually think that you can switch your genitals, for example. And like I would argue that's very, very misleading to tell a
Well, I mean,
kid
isn't
that.
isn't that what bottom surgery literally is? But I think that, like, more so when we're talking about
Um,
like gender identity and, like, kids that identify as trans, I mean, there is no kind of medical transition that is happening to anyone until after the onset of puberty. And even then, after the onset of puberty, it would just be puberty blockers for years while we can assess whether or not they're going to remain constant in that gender identity. But what we do know from the science is that kids actually grasp gender between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. And that's also when they develop the sense of their own gender identity, or who they are. And what we know from this is that, like, this kind of sense of identity which kids develop, you can't like change it through any kind of social conditioning. And I know earlier you were kind of saying things about, like, is this like a choice? And I would say that, like, well, I guess one could certainly argue that there is an element of choice in deciding whether or not one's going to transition, be it socially, or then say, like, later in life as an adult or something medically. Being trans in and of itself is not a choice, in that you don't choose how your gender identity develops. And this is also true for children.
okay.
I guess, like, the analogy would be like, how with like gay people. I mean, I guess one could argue, like, who you actually decide to date. There could be an element of choice in that, but gay people don't choose to feel attraction to the same gender. It's kind of analogous to trans people, as they don't choose what their gender identity is going to be, but I guess there is an
Hmm.
element of choice in transition. Although what we know from the studies is that transition, social transition and medical transition, overwhelmingly improves the mental health and well-being of trans people.
Hmm. Um, yeah. So I think like, growing up in when I was a kid, in grade three, grade four, grade five, or whatever, I remember there was like tomboys in our class. There would be like a more masculine female uh kid.
Yeah,
And
tomboys are
there
real.
and there would be like more effeminate uh young boys. So I'm just kind
Yeah,
of thinking
femboys are
like,
also real.
yeah, and I'm just wondering when it comes to, what kids are told about gender ideology and trans ideology, how do they sort of account for this? Because you're saying when they're like 2 to 5, they're understanding gender already, but it's like, is this not kind of getting into this dangerous territory of like, ironically reinforcing gender roles of like, oh, like he,
Not at
well,
all.
yeah,
Because Oh, not at all, because we recognize that there's a difference between gender identity and gender expression. So gender expression would be like kind of, the ways in which you present yourself, perhaps, certain like social roles we could ascribe as part of like gender presentation, which is different than gender identity or one's internal understanding of themselves. And for kids that have a gender identity that is incongruent with, the gender they were assigned at birth, what's recommended for them is gender therapy, which is precisely to get down to the bottom of, what is this gender identity for them? What's right for them? Why are they feeling these things? And what can we do to help them the best they can? And like I was mentioning earlier, most kids that are referred to this kind of gender therapy, a lot of them end up as just gender nonconforming cis people. So yeah,
Hmm.
I don't think we're confusing that, especially, given the kind of desistance studies we've seen, where a lot of the people that are referred to these clinics end up just being gender nonconforming. So yeah, we certainly can recognize the difference between gender identity and gender expression.
Yeah. So I was chatting with this is an anecdote, so heads up. But I was chatting with this young person. They were in high school or something, and
Mhm.
yeah, they like I kind of asked about trans people and gay people, and they basically said, "Oh, like you're not cool unless you're gay in high school." Like, and I was just kind of like, "Huh, interesting." Like the times they are a changing, but I guess like that really.
I've
Uh,
literally never heard that before. I mean, like gay people are still a minority.
um, Okay, well, I mean, this was just kind of the experience of somebody who was in Canada here going to high school. Um, I mean, I certainly think there is a trendiness to the LGBT right now, LGBTQ right now. Like, I think it's kind of like a very hot in
How
thing.
soon?
How
I guess like
so?
I just don't see like how being gay could be trendy, given that like I mean queer people still face oppression, like interpersonal discrimination. There's even instances of institutional discrimination that still exists against queer people, in the laws of this country.
So I think that there's a lot of horrible discrimination against LGBTQ plus people outside of North America, especially. Like, in underdeveloped countries, it's absolutely horrific. Like if you even go to Jamaica, yeah, it's horrible. Like, they will get like
Oh, I would
hunted down.
absolutely agree that in all those other countries, the kind of discrimination is a lot worse. But that's
I
not
would say it's
to say
not
that there's
even,
not
I would say
still
it's,
real discrimination that people in the North Americas face today.
but it's not really comparable for the most part. Like on average, it's like, how many gay people are getting like, acid attacks or like, thrown off of buildings. Like I don't think that's happening
It's not
in
the kind
North
of
America,
discrimination
for
I'm
example.
talking about. I'm talking more so about, the kind of bullying, the kind of social ostracization. It's a lot more subtle here, but I think that it still is bad and worth addressing. I'm not trying to say that like, gay people are being like, hit with like acid attacks or whatever in the States, at least not very often. I'm more so talking about kind of like social ostracization type discrimination. And there also are still some laws on the books which are discriminatory and exclusionary of LGBTQ people. And I can name a couple if you're interested.
No, it's all right. That's all right. Let's stay on topic here. Um, when it comes to like the popularity thing, and like it's like I kind of put forth this idea that it's like it's cool to be gay in high school now. I don't know if that's necessarily true. This is what this one person said, but I just think adolescence and growing up, being a kid, and you can disagree if you want. I think it's a pretty confusing time. And like I'll think it's kind of funny, but I'll hear like the sort of plight and the concerns and the struggles of a trans person or someone struggling with their gender identity, and they'll say, "I don't feel like I fit in my body. I don't feel like I'm the person I'm supposed to be. I feel insecure. I feel this." And it's like that sounds like you're a teenager. Like that sounds like you're a hormonal teenager who's like trying to find your way in the world. And I'm not trying to like, denigrate what these people may or may not think that they are, but it's also like I think it's kind of messed up that there's kind of this option of like, hey, well, maybe you should mess around with these hormone blockers to solve your adolescence angst. Because I think it's very normal for
I
like a
mean, they're not
teenager or something.
giving, wait, wait, wait. They're not giving away like puberty blockers like they're candy or something. I mean, if a trans teenager wants to get on puberty blockers, they have to go through gender therapy for years and receive multiple therapist letters Like this is not a process that just kind of gets thrown out willy-nilly. Like it is a year-long therapy process where psychiatrists and doctors work with this teenager to figure out is this identity genuine and if transition is right for them, and what that transition would look like, be it simply just a social transition or would a medical transition benefit them. My point is that like it's not this kind of just like trendy thing where like somebody rolls up to their doctor and like, hey, I'm trans, give me puberty blockers. That's not how it works at all. Like you have to go through years of therapy, psychiatrists, doctors, the whole process just to even be considered for puberty blockers.
Um, is this
And what
across
we have from
America,
the
or
studies is that
is this across America? Or you're in the States, are you?
I am in the States. Yeah, this is pretty standard across the states. And actually, we do have studies on trans youth and whether or not they remain in their gender identity. There was this really great 5-year longitudinal study from the peer-reviewed Pediatrics Journal of this year, 2022. They studied 317 binary trans kids who were aged 3 through 12 at the start of the study and who had all socially transitioned prior to the start of the study. And so the goal of the study was to assess whether or not they remained in that trans identity 5 years after the study. And what they found is that out of those that went on to take puberty blockers, which was 92 of them, 95% or 95.7% still identified as binary transgender, 3.3% identified as non-binary transgender by the end, and only 1.1% got off the puberty blockers, which was just one kid.
Okay.
And out of those that went on to take cross-sex hormones, none of them stopped taking them. So the systems we have in place seem to be very effective at ensuring that the people that are taking these medicines are actually benefiting from them. Because in this study, we had about 100 kids that went on puberty blockers. Only one of them stopped, and that kid's not going to have any, kind of long-term irreversible effects. And then out of those that went on to take cross-sex hormones at age, like 16, 14, depending on when they started, none of them detransitioned. It seemed to be very effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I kind of want to get into the whole big pharma profit aspect of this. I don't know if you'd
I
considered
mean, I'm a
this.
leftist. I will nationalize big pharma if you want.
So, the thing, when you nationalize big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies are going to make a lot of money off that, right? Because the taxes are just going into the pockets of big pharmaceutical companies, right?
What I mean by nationalizing big pharma, as in now the government is going to take over those companies and run them not for profit.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Well,
I think that
on
any industry which has perfectly inelastic demand, for example, medicine, I mean, people have to take their medicine to be alive. I think, and therefore they don't have any kind of control over their demand for that product. Simply, companies can manipulate the market in ways that are unfair, that are mathematically inefficient, and therefore the best thing to do is to have a nonprofit organization, owned by the people, which distributes this
okay,
for the
okay, okay.
people.
But we're sorry to cut you off, but we're kind of getting into territory that's like not in our reality, right? Like that doesn't really exist right now.
Well, I'm saying we should do that. I mean, if your
Sure.
genuine concern is about big pharma, then that's the kind of thing I'd like to talk about with big pharma. I guess like I think that the big pharma issue is completely tangential to whether or not we should be helping trans youth. And
Well,
so if we're going to talk about
so
big pharma, I'm going to talk about like nationalization. If we're going to talk about trans
sure,
youth, then I'm going to
but
talk about the scientific studies.
that's fine. But we have to talk about how things currently are right now, and currently how they are right now. Big pharma, I don't know the companies who sell the different hormones or the different treatments that trans people need to take for the rest of their lives. But when you get into like marketing and sales, there's a term called lifetime value. And if you can make a kid become trans for the rest of their life, that is huge lifetime value for a pharmaceutical company. And you have to understand that this is exactly how a big pharmaceutical company thinks. They're like, how can we sell more of this product? And it's like, well, what if we get somebody taking our hormones for the rest of their lives, that's like $1 million lifetime value of this person, assuming that they live for like, 50, 60
Oh,
more
I,
years.
I will absolutely agree that big pharma is going to use this, as a predatory system to make profit. Same thing they did with the opioid crisis. Same thing. I mean, how they price gouge with insulin. Yeah, this is a pretty universal problem with big pharma. It's in nowhere way exclusive to trans people.
Right. So, and, I don't want to get into the whole cough and pandy covey stuff that we've been going through. However, there are theories and, they're pretty there's a lot to dig into there. Theories that perhaps these studies, perhaps this science is being influenced by big pharma money to give us the conclusion we want to then justify more of their products. And in this case, all the studies
Do
that
you
you're
have
listing off, I
do you
guess I
have
want
any
to ask
evidence for
how much I want to ask how much faith, like you put a lot of faith in these studies that you're reading off right now. And
yeah. So
it's to the benefit of big pharma profits, right?
I'm a PhD student. I actually like do research as like my day job. And what I can tell you is that the funding that you get to do research is completely detached from, the specific problems that you research and completely detached from any kind of results you get on that research. Essentially, like when you receive a gift to do a type of research, that gift is directed towards a very broad area. It's only like grants that can be like more specific, targeted towards specific problems. But when you have these gifts for research, there is no obligation to obtain any kind of, answer to a specific problem, and there's absolutely zero obligation to have certain results for those problems. I would guess, like, I would have to ask, do you have any evidence that like something like this is happening, or is this like entirely conspiratorial?
No, this has happened in the past many times. Like there was a study of trying to make marijuana look like it was bad for you. There's the case of, the old really crude case for cigarettes, where it's like 9 out of 10 doctors say smoking Lucky Strike is, more healthy for you. Like there's a lot of like very real historical examples, and
I mean, like
I
with
think it's
regards to
important.
like the LGBT or like the trans research in particular.
No, no, I not specific for that. No, like I said, I've never actually dug into that stuff before. Um, However, I think the profit motive is there, and that's why I think people should kind of be aware of that, because I'd love to think it's about love and light and loving yourself, but like big pharma just have big dollar signs in their eyes because it's like, wow, imagine we made all these lifetime customers for these hormones, like $1 million out of each customer because they're taking it for the rest of their life. But I do want to ask, and I'll let someone else come in here soon. I do want to ask, lastly, because I watched the that movie. I watched the What Is a Woman, and I've seen your debates before, and you have that in the title. And
Hmm.
the one thing that I wanted to ask you about, I'm sure you'll have a study to debunk it probably, but there was the one person, woman transitioning into a man, I believe, and she was like, there isn't. Her claim was there's no long-term studies on like these hormones, and like
Yeah, it's
it's
completely
really not
false.
good. It's completely false.
Yeah, we actually have long-term studies on hormones.
How
Actually, the
many?
first research on like trans hormones was done in Weimar, Germany. A lot of that research was burned by the really bad German party. But we do have, long-term studies of trans people and trans hormones. I know that, let's see, this was a study over, let's see, over 20 years, and they were assessing the mortality of people that medically transitioned. And what they found is that essentially the increase in mortality in trans people was due to non-hormonal causes. Essentially, it was due to things like unaliving, due to things like having, poor health outcomes due to their socioeconomic status, and it was not due to anything which the hormones were causing.
All right. Once again, I feel like you're putting a lot of faith in these studies, and I yeah, I don't know. I personally like my original kind of TikTok mentions. Like I think it's because a lot of what people from your perspective will say is like, hey, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong with kind of just letting kids know about this? What's wrong with just kind of like, putting these ideas into kids' heads? And for me, the big thing comes down to like, I'm in my 30s and my sex life is kind of complicated. Sometimes I'm wondering what I want out of a partner, for example. And it's like we're kind of presenting this conversation at a younger and younger age to the point where it's like, yeah, what's your gender expression? And it's like, why is this so important to like educate kids on this at such a young age? And
Oh, I can
I
explain
also
exactly why
worry
it's
though,
important to talk about this at a young age. Also, I'm not sure why you were talking about like sex life stuff because like gender and like like attraction is not just about that. I mean, like there are like gay people who are like asexual, for example. So also these topics can be completely detached from sexuality and explained in age
I
appropriate manners to
I
children.
totally
But broadly,
I see what you're saying with that, but I just want to say I don't really buy that. Like the whole thing that like gender is separate from sexual expression. Like I get the theory, but I think we're kind of kidding ourselves when it comes to that because and this kind of gets into another conversation. I'm sorry to derail what you were saying there, but I think that this word gender is actually well, it's not even that old of a word, right? Like, John Money kind of coined it back in like what, 80 years ago or something like that. Like it's a fairly new word. Um, and it's kind of like I personally think the way people use gender now is actually just personal expression. They're like, oh, my gender expression, my gender, this, my oh, I'm a demigirl, I'm a this, and it's like I think you're just kind of a unique individual with a unique personality and a unique expression of who you want to be. Whether we have to call that a different gender or like maybe it's partially masculine, it's partially feminine, it's a combination, whatever. Like my name's Greg. I have my own personal expression. I don't need to put a label on my personal expression and call it like a unique gender.
yeah, no one's saying you have to put like a label on your unique expression. But I think that if people, have terms to better understand themselves and how they want to express themselves, I think that's overall a good thing as long as, they're not being used to like hurt people in any way. But to go back to like the point I was trying to finish earlier about why it's important to talk about these topics at a young age, we have strong sociological evidence which finds that children develop implicit biases from a very young age. And in a world where, most people are straight, where most of the, kind of family relationships people see are mommy and daddy, it is a very natural inclination to have an implicit bias against non-traditional family types. And, simply educating
And
children about the fact about the world that different family structures exist. Some families have a mommy and a daddy, but also some families have two mommies, some families have two daddies. These are all okay and valid types of families to have, is completely age appropriate. It's completely detached from, sexuality. And it just teaches, diversity and acceptance in a normalizing way, which addresses the implicit biases already forming in the young kids' minds. And you can do the same thing about trans people as well.
right, so the thing with that is though, it's like, oh, we shouldn't have biases about, things that are non-straight traditional family. But I feel like we're kind of fighting human nature at that point. It's like people are always going to have like I'm sorry to say, like you can call me um, a jerk if you want, but people are always going to have biases, and whether that's like having to do with race, whether that's having to do with gender, whether that's having to do with transgender, like you know, like a lot of people on the left have this like utopia vision that everyone is going to get along someday, and it's like I just really I don't think that's ever going to happen. Like, and at the
Well,
same
it
time, I don't.
certainly is the case that these kind of biases are natural, but that doesn't mean that we should just give in to these natural inclinations. For example, tribalism is a very natural part of human nature,
Mhm,
but tribalism leads to a lot of very bad demonstrable harm. And,
sure.
implicit biases certainly lead to the kind of social ostracization type of harms, which do definitely still exist today. And,
Mhm.
we can address these simply through education. And I think that using education to, try to combat these negative natural inclinations is a good thing. Just because something's natural doesn't mean it's a good thing. And if we can fight the negative outcomes with education, then that's a positive.
Okay, well, I mean, what about the scenario when there's a young boy, he wears a dress one day, and it's like, hey, like you might be a girl. And then, however, this idea got into his head, I don't know. But then he starts to go down the path of it's like the idea in his head, like, yeah, maybe I'm a girl, maybe I'm a girl, maybe I'm a girl. And then he starts to do the gender affirmation care, and then it's like, a year long of therapy of, yeah, maybe you are a girl. Yeah, are you ready to take the hormones? Like,
That's not how gender therapy works. Gender therapy doesn't tell you
I
maybe you
know
are a
it
girl.
I'm sure
What
it's
the
more
purpose of
calm.
gender therapy is to ask you, how do you see yourself in terms of gender? Why do you see yourself that way? How do you want to express yourself? Do you, like which group do you think you belong to and why? It's much more of an investigation of like what are you feeling and why are you feeling that way? It's not about telling people, oh, you're going to be this thing. And also trans people and LGBTQ people are overwhelmingly strongly supportive of people that are gender nonconforming. I think that it tends to be more so the conservative side that has a very negative reaction when, like a boy wears a dress or something.
I mean, for me personally, I definitely lean more conservative, and my main concern is like I said about the kind of Santa Claus example. It's like I feel like we're putting a lot of, you can call it just gender ideas, but I think it's sexual ideas into the minds of kids long before they are ever going to have a sex life, be dating anyone. So it's like,
I
why are we
just
kind of why are we preloading this kid's mind with all of these kind of ideas about gender expression and who they might be dating when they're so young? Because it's like, I'm sorry, it's kind of nice to be a young kid who doesn't have to worry about that stuff. And I think it's kind of crazy that we think it's a good thing to talk so much about gender. It's like who really cares? Like let the kids play soccer, let the kids wear a dress, whatever. Like why does it have to be such a why is there so much attention being put on this?
So I don't think that it's in any way inherently attached to segs. Like for example, when I think about how these kinds of topics are approached to say younger kids, it's more so the idea of different family structures exist, different relationship structures exist, and it's not even the kind of thing where you have to tell kids that like, oh, you're going to like figure out who you're attracted to or whatnot. It's just the idea that different family structures exist. For example, if a kid goes to say like a job fair or something where they're like, oh, these are different like jobs that exist. The knowledge of different jobs existing doesn't, force them to like make a choice about like what job they're going to have when they're an adult. It doesn't make them, have to like, ruminate over this. Just the idea that gay and trans people exist doesn't make kids have to think about it. It simply teaches them a fact about the world, which we know is going to help address their implicit biases.
Yeah, so I mean, the exception kind of proves the rule though, right? Most families are a man and a woman, and you know, that's how most families are. And like I get it. It's like, sometimes there's two mommies, sometimes there's two daddies. But like that kind of work, that job example wasn't really a good one because it's like, you know, it's not just saying, hey, there's other jobs out there. It's saying no, like sometimes this is how what a normal family is, and sometimes there's like, alternative families that look like this. And I think
That's
that like
entirely a matter of phrasing. I mean, one could say that like, a kind of office job is a normal job and all these other jobs are non-traditional jobs. Or you could just frame it as these are
yeah,
different types
but
of jobs that exist, just like these are different types of family structures that exist. I don't think
no,
you have
but
to say it in a light where it's
it's
like these are normal, these are abnormal, because that's entirely subjective. The point is that there
I
exists
don't
a
think it is
diversity
though.
of family structures, just like how there exists a diversity of jobs. And I think this kind of like normal versus abnormal language is unproductive. I don't think it really like accomplishes anything.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a reason there's a family with a man and a woman, and it's to procreate and it's just to have a child, right? And
I
it's
mean,
like,
gay people can have kids too.
yeah, but not in a actual procreation way. They can adopt, they can get a surrogate or something like this. But and I guess
I mean,
like
what about
it
like in vitro fertilization? That's literally like, procreating.
right, but it again, it's still not it's still you need some extra sort of thing. It's not just a normal family with a man and a woman who did it the old-fashioned way. And
Is
I'm
there
not
anything
trying.
wrong with is there anything wrong with them doing it a different way?
Not necessarily, but I think it's kind of weird to teach kids or to try to convince ourselves that what is statistically a minority is just as normal as what's statistically a majority.
I
Like
mean,
there's
black people are just as normal as white people, right?
that's not a good comparison because if you go to Africa, then it's like, that's flipped, right?
Well, yeah, and I would say that white people should also be treated as just as normal as black people in Africa. My point is that even in all of these different societies where there are, these different minorities, they should all be treated as, valid equals, not as the normal versus abnormal.
And that's where I think a lot of social justice and a lot of like the whole trans movement is kind of going wrong. It's like you're never I don't think you're ever going to convince people of that. That is just as normal. Like, I'm sorry, you're not going to convince me that somebody who has to regularly take hormones to maintain their gender expression is as normal as somebody who doesn't have to take hormones on a regular basis.
I
Like
mean, there are
that's,
even plenty of cisgender people that have to regularly take hormones due to hormone deficiencies that are
but again,
natural in their
that
body.
is an exception. That is an exception that proves the rule. You know, people like to say, "Oh, there's some women who are infertile," and it's like, yeah, but that's not common, and that's not a good thing when a woman's infertile. That's not like something to say, "Oh, yeah, so it's common for
So
women to be
I would
infertile." Like, no, it's
certainly
not
I
common.
would certainly agree that these are exceptions, but the point of pointing out that they're exceptions doesn't detract from the fact that they are still valid and they still deserve equal respect and that they deserve access to, the systems which they need in order to, fully self-actualize themselves. I think that
Sure.
like pointing out that these are, rare or pointing out that these are, a minority, it doesn't really do anything productive because ultimately different types of people exist and normalizing diversity is a good thing at a social level.
I think I partially agree with that, and I think it comes down to like the equality sort of thing. You know, people are like fighting for equality, but we have to remember it's equality under the eyes of the law. Like it's equality under as much as we can be equal. And I think with the trans thing, it's like, yeah, like be accepting. But once again, I think where it's kind of going too far is like, yeah, we are just as common and just as normal and exactly the same. We're just like a straight family with two straight people.
Nobody's trying to say, wait. I need to correct this because nobody in good faith is trying to say that like trans and gay people are like just as common and
You're
identical as,
saying
like cisgender
you
straight
have right there,
people.
trans women are women.
Yeah, just like how cis women are women, just like how short women are women, just like how tall women are women. There are differences between short and tall women, but they're still women due to the commonalities they have.
Yeah, but well, like,
I'm not saying that there are no differences. In fact, me
well,
using the
but
word
that's
trans and
exactly
cis
what you're
is
saying. You're
me
saying trans
explicitly
women are
recognizing
women.
that differences. Wait, I need to be clear. Me using the terms trans and cis is me explicitly recognizing that differences do exist. And my broader point is that, yes, I acknowledge these differences exist, but we have to acknowledge all the similarities, which, make them deserve to be grouped together in the broader category of woman.
So
Thank you
you
for the
admit
galaxy, by
that
the way.
you admit differences exist, but you're also saying that trans women are women. So, and I
Yeah,
mean, I haven't watched the debates. I'm sure you've
think about it
like
like this.
yeah,
So I would say that Catholics and Protestants are both Christians. Now, obviously, there's a lot of difference in what
bruh,
Catholics and
come on.
Protestants believe. There's a lot of differences between these two groups, but broadly, they're both Christians because of the similar properties they have. Yeah, we can acknowledge that differences exist while them still belonging to a broader category. Yeah, that's just basically like, looking at how subcategories within a broader category have different attributes on average. That's fine.
Right, but I mean, just to kind of get straight to the point, like what defines a woman, in my opinion, is the fact that she is like, you know, her sexual organs and that she has the opportunity potentially, or her body is designed to bear children. Like that's kind of like the
Now,
fundamental
would you
thing.
exclude someone from now I would certainly say that generally that holds, but would you exclude someone from the category of woman if they didn't meet that criteria?
Uh, if we were talking about that word in like, if we were, yeah, I would exclude people if we were trying to like make sure words consistently meant something.
So if you were to enforce the definition, you would have to exclude lots of intersex people, which you and I would both, I would think would consider them to be women.
Well, I think intersex is actually a great example that gets not talked about enough in the trans conversation because that is an exception that does throw a wrench into the whole conversation. Because I would argue that women are women, trans women are women, and intersex people are intersex people who have, you know, maybe if they have two sets of female organs, there would probably be more likely to be called a woman because they only have women's female organs. See how I used women there to define the intersex person to be more of a woman based on their genitalia?
I mean, there are intersex women, there are intersex men, there are some intersex people who's, there are non-binary intersex people. But if we're talking strictly about sex categories, there would be intersex people which do fall more so on the female side of things. There are intersex people which do fall more so on the male side of things, and there are some intersex people, albeit more rare, that in terms of their sex characteristics are pretty ambiguous.
Okay, so I mean, but it's pretty clear that intersex wouldn't be fall under trans women or women, and that
Right. I'm
trans
using
women
intersex as
is
an
different.
analogy, simply because my broader point was that you recognize that there are these intersex women that are still women, even though your definition of woman would definitionally exclude some of them. And what I'm saying is that this kind of, definition is more so a general rule rather than some kind of exclusionary criteria. Because if you enforce an exclusionary criteria, you have to exclude a lot of intersex women from womanhood, from womanhood. In particular, say complete androgen sensitivity is a great example of an intersex condition, which I think you and I would both consider these people to be women. However, your definition, based off of potential to reproduce, would probably place them more so in the male category.
Um, this is someone who looks like more a woman, but or does not look like a woman, but can reproduce. You said.
So someone that has complete androgen sensitivity, they will have a vulva. So downstairs they'll have female genitalia. However, they don't have a womb. They don't have ovaries. They actually have internal testicles.
Mm,
They have XY chromosomes. Their body simply cannot process testosterone. Therefore, their
mm.
body feminizes instead of masculinizing.
Right. So,
And they are
and
all
that's
like
super.
assigned. They are all like assigned female at birth on like their birth certificate and stuff. Because the way
Mhm.
that doctors determine that is based off of looking at your genitals. So all of these complete androgen sensitivity cases, they will have female on their birth certificate. They are raised as women, and biologically speaking, in terms of like a lot of these anatomical cases, they are female in most every way. However, in like terms of reproductive stuff, they don't have female reproductive organs, and they actually have testicles.
Right. But would you say though, when it comes to intersex woman or man, they're gonna have a set of something or a set of the other, or something in
In terms
between.
of what?
Well, in terms of like an intersex person is going to have genitalia from one sex or another.
There are also ambiguous genitalia that does exist.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And like like so it's like is it a combination of a female organ and a male organ, or like what do you mean ambiguous?
It's basically kind of in between. So you can like Google this if you want. It's kind of hard to describe this in
Yeah,
particulars.
we don't have to
But
get
essentially,
graphic
like
here.
they will have like a glans, which is in between what is typical of females and males, and they will typically have some kind of like shallow canal, and it can be rather ambiguous what
Okay.
precisely it is.
So I wanted to get to your third point here because you say biological sex is not a binary. Would you say it's a spectrum though?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're talking about like biological sex characteristics, biological sex is a composite variable. This is how biologists and clinicians view biological sex. By composite variable, I mean it has many attributes, as in it's not just, say, chromosomes or the way in which you can reproduce, but also hormones, anatomy, even brain matter distributions are sexually dimorphic in humans. And all of these sex characteristics, they exist on a spectrum, or at least they exist in more than two possible combinations in terms of like chromosomes and stuff. And so there is the spectrum of characteristics, and precisely the discrete categories we map from that spectrum. There's a degree of arbitrarity in that. I mean, you certainly could try to divide a line such that we only have male, female. You could also draw lines where you have different like intersex categories. The scientific truth is that these characteristics exist along a spectrum, but we as humans, when we try to map these discrete characteristics that exist along a spectrum into categories, there's a degree of arbitrarity in the categories we select, at least in terms of where we draw those boundaries and in terms of how many categories we decide there are.
Yeah, but if we were kind of to lay out all the stats, thank you for explaining that, by the way.
Yeah.
If we were to lay out all the stats and all the probabilities of everything, would we not get a huge, like almost 50% people presenting with male genitalia, almost 50% people presenting with female genitalia, and then a very, very small, less than 1% that are somewhere in between on the intersex. And of course, the people
We
who
would get
present with male or female genitalia might have some other things in the background. Maybe their testosterone's not as high. Maybe this isn't as high. But like, if we were to base it on that, these sort of physical characteristics of this person, it would be mostly male genitalia, mostly female, and then there'd be this small, 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 small sliver in between that would be like less than 1%. That
so
is the intersex category.
oh, you're almost spot on. It would indeed be a bimodal distribution, which is kind of what you're describing, where there's kind of these two rough averages and then a smaller portion in between. That's called a bimodal distribution. By definition, bimodal
Bimodal.
distributions
That's
exist
almost
on a
binary.
spectrum.
That's almost binary.
Bimodal and
Bimodal.
binary are very different words that mean
It's
very
pretty
different
close.
things.
It's pretty
Wait,
close
wait.
though.
No, no, no. So the difference is a binary implies that there's only ever two options, while a bimodal spectrum or a bimodal distribution recognizes that there is an underlying spectrum and things are more so roughly distributed in one of two directions. And I also think that you might be underestimating the portion of the population which is intersex. If we view biological sex as a composite variable, like clinicians and biologists do, it would be almost 2% of the population that is intersex, because atypical sex characteristics in some of these categories are more common than a lot of these very, very hyperspecific intersex conditions.
Right. Just to add to that, though, I think there's correct me if I'm wrong, but a big part of intersex of that 2% would basically just be men who have like extra men parts or female who have extra female parts. I've heard the most common one is females who actually have an extra female part downstairs. Like I actually know a friend who had an extra female part downstairs, and she didn't consider herself intersex. She was just a woman.
Well, you can be intersex and a woman. Those are not mutually exclusive by any means.
But I think if you have only parts from a female parts, then I think it's kind of, if you only have female parts, you're a woman. If you only have male parts, you're a man. I think that's kind of the best way to define it, right?
That's certainly one way you could draw these boundaries. There are
Sure.
certainly other ways you could draw these boundaries.
Okay.
But broadly, this almost 2% number, I believe it does exclusively come from people that have mixed sex characteristics to some extent.
Okay.
It could be something as simple as like gynecomastia in a dude who is otherwise, biologically male, and all these other categories, or it could be something where somebody is much more in the kind of middle of the sexes, something such as like ovotesticular syndrome.
hmm Okay. So let's just go back to number one then. So I think trans women are trans women, and I think women are women. So why are you trying to say that they're the same thing? Like
So,
what's the argument here?
what you just said was tautologically true. Obviously, trans women are women. Obviously, women are women. That is true tautologically. And I'm not trying to say that trans women are the exact same as cis women. Just that women is a broader category, which trans women are a part of, which cis women are a part of, which say short women are a part of, tall women are a part of, black women are a part of, white women are a part of.
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
This
whoa!
is just how adjectives work. When you put an adjective in front of a noun, it's still a part of the noun.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between a short woman and somebody who used to be a man, right? Like you just compared a
Uh-huh.
short woman and somebody who used to be a man,
Yeah,
or like
different
well,
adjectives
it's
mean
kind
different
of
things.
in a way, kind of still is a man to be frank. But
So I guess like what would you say like excludes trans women from womanhood? Like what is the
mm,
necessary characteristic for women to have which trans women cannot possess?
a womb.
So once again, there are plenty of intersex women that are born without
Again, this is a
wombs
tiny
that you
sliver,
and
though. This
I
is a tiny,
hold up, hold
tiny,
up.
tiny sliver of people.
But that's the point. It's not a necessary criteria. I would absolutely agree that generally women have wombs, but you and I both recognize that there are women who do not possess wombs. Therefore, it can't be some kind of necessary criteria. I would certainly agree with that, the general rule that women generally have wombs, but you recognize there are women that don't have wombs. So it's unfair and inconsistent to hold that standard over trans women that you don't hold over intersex women.
I don't think that's unfair and inconsistent because I think you need to like if you talk about the woman who does not have a womb or the woman who is intersex or the woman who can't bear children, like that's a tragedy. That's something that's like sad where it's like, oh man, like this woman has kind of failed in being able to participate in womanhood or motherhood, and that is unfortunate because that's like a fundamental thing
What
of
about
being a woman, in my
what about
opinion.
women that voluntarily receive hysterectomies? They wouldn't have wombs, and I wouldn't say that's a tragedy by any means. It's something they desired.
Right, but that's their choice. I guess my point is
Yeah,
a
and it's
woman
trans women's
is
choice to transition.
right, but they made that choice as a man.
So what if they used to be a man? They're a woman now.
Well, I mean, it's it becomes a problem, I think, when maybe they don't get bottom surgery and then they walk into like a female's change room, for example, and they're like, "I'm a woman," and it's like you got something dangling between your legs there, ma'am. That's kind of when it becomes a problem. Like we can
So
start
I mean,
talking
like
about why this is a
I've
problem.
I've used like bathrooms and changing rooms, and I have not once had to like flash
Yeah,
anyone
but that's
because like I
your
just go into like a
experience.
stall. Like that,
That's
it's pretty simple.
Yeah, but like, there's instances where well, let's just go to the extreme example. And I've actually heard this from parole officers. I have a friend of a friend whose mom is a parole officer in a jail here in Canada. And
Hmm.
there will be people who have been convicted of non-consensual sex, okay? Not like that's why they're in jail. Non-consensual. They're a born man having non-consensual with a woman. That's why they're in jail. And these men go and they use like the human rights tribunal angle to say, actually, I'm a woman now and I want to be in a woman's jail. And sometimes they're like letting these people who are in jail for having non-consensual sex with women. Like, do you see how this is an issue, especially
So
when they don't even
this
get
is
bottom
I want
surgery?
to be clear. This is extremely hyperbolic, but I mean, you could still come up with reasonable policies to address that. Something such as requiring, living
Well,
in your transition gender for, say, like a year or two before any kind of crime is committed to be able to go into like a women's prison. Like there are ways you can address that, but like that is extremely hyperbolic
it's a
and
real thing
absolutely
that's
does not
happening
represent the
though.
general case.
Like you can call it an anecdote if you want, but like it's not hyperbolic because this is happening. This is a thing that's happening, and I think that, you know, again, I'm a
Do
political
you have like
junkie. I'm a
Do you have like a
political.
source of that happening? Like, is there any data which shows that like, this is something that's happening more than just like an anecdote? Like, do you even have like a source for an anecdote on that?
I could get a name of the scenario that's happened in Canada, but it would take me a while because I'd have to reach out to the parole officer. I'm sure you can find other scenarios of it happening though. And I'm a political junkie, so I look at things in these terms, and I feel like something more progressive policies do, or more like left-wing policies do, is they kind of assume that bad people don't exist and won't take advantage of the rules. And in this case,
Not
there's
true at
someone.
all. I presented a policy we could implement which would address people, trying to weaponize a disingenuously claimed identity. But if you want
But
to
it's
talk about
but that's
real
not in
data,
reality
what
though.
we
Is
know
that
from the real data is that when trans women are put into men's prison, they are overwhelmingly, beaten, abused, and assaulted. We have real data which demonstrates that. Meanwhile, there exists zero empirical evidence, zero actual data which would show that trans women are any harm to cis women. If you want to challenge me on this topic, I'm going to require a source on, data
I,
which shows that
I'm
trans women are harming cis women in prison because I have not seen any data on that happening, but I know there does exist real scientific empirical data which show that trans women are harmed by men when they're forced to go into men's prisons.
I'm sorry I laughed because you said there's no data of a trans woman hurting a woman, and like there's a case of like a trans woman MMA fighter like beating up a biological woman. So that's
We're talking
kind of,
about prisons.
I know we're talking about prisons, but you
And
know,
also, an anecdote is not empirical data. I'm asking for like data, like studies, like, is there a percentage increase in like the violence which say like cis women would face in prisons if there was
mhm.
a trans inclusive policy adopted? I don't think that there exists any evidence which would show such a thing. However, I do know there exists evidence which shows that there is a real harm to trans women, a real increase in harm when they are placed in men's prisons.
Um, okay, so yeah, I don't know. Thanks for having me. It's been pretty fun chatting this out. I don't know if there's anything else that we can go over. I would say that I don't know. I'm still I like my main thing is protecting kids, and I just think it's like dangerous. Like, we can have this optimism that kids will understand what transgenderism is and they'll understand all this, but I think I personally think it's kind of naive to like and actually irresponsible to kind of like present these ideas to children and think, yeah, they're going to have a grown-up understanding of all this, and I frankly just think it's kind of almost like a distracting
I
waste of
I
their
don't think you actually
time.
need to have them have a grown up understanding on these topics. I think that you want them to have a kid's understanding on these topics. For example, just the idea, oh, hey, when Naomi was born, the doctors thought she was a boy and she looked like a boy, but then later in life, she transitioned and became a girl, and now Naomi's a girl. I think that kids can understand that. And, at their age, I think that that's appropriately all they really need to understand is just like, oh, Naomi used to be a boy and now she's a girl, and that's okay.
Right, but there's that's even that, even though like that's a nice innocent example, that's kind of dishonest.
In what way is it dishonest?
Well, like we were saying, like it's not, trans women aren't real women. Like, you can't
You
reproduce
didn't
and have a
provide any,
child.
you didn't provide, wait, you never provided a single reason which stood up why trans women were not women. I asked you for any kind of like necessary criteria, which trans women don't
I said
have,
bearing
and
children,
you
bearing
could not
children,
produce a necessary criteria
bearing
which
children,
stood the test.
bearing children.
But you once again, you don't think that's a necessary criteria because you recognize that there are women that don't have that
Yeah,
don't
but
have that
that's
capacity.
that's the exception that proves the rule. This is the tiny sliver percentage exception
I
that
didn't
proves the
ask you what
rule.
is generally true about women. I asked you what is necessary for being a woman, and you recognize that there are women that don't have that capacity. Therefore, it's not necessary. I
So
think
so
are
but
you
this is
mishearing me? I'm asking about what's necessary, not what's generally true.
But this is a great example because we're having a very intricate conversation about the specifics of these definitions, and a child would not understand the consequences of these specifics of these different definitions. And this is kind of getting to the point of why I
But
think
that's
it's
not what a child
irresponsible.
understands a woman to be. Children don't understand women to be baby machines. Children understand women much more so as far as like social differences. When you ask kids about like, oh, what's different about boys and girls, they will typically point to social differences, not anything biological.
Well, maybe we should teach kids that women are more baby machines, and that's kind of what that's kind of what they're known for. That's the
I think it's kind of cringe to reduce women down to baby machines, to be honest, because women can live fully self-actualized lives without,
who
producing
else
kids.
who else has made babies? I'm pretty sure it's
I
just
mean,
been
trans
women.
men have made babies, non-binary people have made babies.
Okay, okay. Like, really?
And also, there are plenty of women that are real women that live fully self-actualized lives despite not producing, kids biologically, and that's fine too.
Yeah, but historically, this is a statistic for you. Historically, 100% of the babies born came from women. Biological women, I
You
guess
do
I
know
should
that
say.
like trans men and like third genders and such have existed like throughout human history, right?
What do you mean third genders? You told me that it's that biological sex is bimodal.
So there have
What's the
been
third
cultures
one?
which have legally and socially recognized other genders. Actually, even the traditional Jewish societies, which are described in the Bible, legally and socially recognized at least six different genders. We can talk about like native populations and like two spirit. These are more so social distinctions necessarily than biological ones, because these societies recognize that there was a social distinction as well as a biological distinction.
Yeah, sure, but like, and this is the thing. If I was a woman and I had a womb and I gave birth to a child, and I could say, "Hey, I have two spirits. I have a man spirit. I'm more of a man," and then you'd be like, yeah, we have to accept that he says he's a man even though he's bearing a child. And this is kind of where I lose a lot of this sort of stuff because there is a difference
Nobody
between
said you
the
have to accept that.
well, I mean, sure we do. If somebody says that they
I'm
present
just
as
trying
a
to
female
explain
and they
why
say
it is
I'm
the
a
most
trans woman,
consistent and logical. Why it is most consistent and logical to accept that. I've never said you have to accept that.
yeah, but in a way, this is kind of actually what all the education is about. Because if you don't accept people for how they feel inside and say, "Hey, I'm a trans woman," you can't make fun of that person because they're like they clearly look like a man and they're saying they're a woman. Like that's part of the education, right? Is to say, "Oh no, that person's actually going to unalive themselves if you tease them for that." So isn't that's
Well,
actually what it's all about?
I think that it's good to
Validating.
teach kids not to bully other people, especially along like protected attributes. I mean, like, it would be really messed up if like a kid was bullied for like, being black, for example.
I'm not saying that I want to make fun of people in the people are saying in the comments. It's more that people are going to be people, kids are going to be kids, and they're going to make fun of people who are different. Like that's just a reality. And I guess that's
So should
actually
we try
another
to address bullying or should we just like accept that bullying is going to happen and let it run rampant?
I
Because the
think yeah,
solution is we
no,
should address
that's
bullying.
this is a different topic and I have an opinion that you probably won't like, but envision Stonewall. You know, Stonewall that happened in New York, the big like, the big movement for the LGBTQ plus thing. The
Yeah.
the trans women then, the trans people then, the gay people then, they were very, very strong. They were strong characters. They were very resilient. They had a lot. They were up against a lot back then. Okay. And these days I find it funny because it's like oh, you need to police what everybody is going to say or think about me. It's like, no, what about instilling a stronger character in people? And I gotta say, like,
I want to be
I
clear. I
think,
don't think that you need to police everything that people are saying. I try to have these conversations just so I can point out why it is the most consistent and logical, way to view these topics. I'm not in any way trying to enforce people that they have to, say certain things or believe certain things. I'm just explaining why I believe that this is the most consistent, logical worldview.
well, I think we're getting into like the dangerous territory where, you know, we want to almost like validate someone's mental illness, where it's like, I don't know, like people are going to
Explain.
be body dysmorphia, no, gender dysmorphia.
Gender
Is that
dysphoria is the
gender
condition that a
dysphoria?
lot of trans people have, which is
Hmm.
not a delusional disorder, by the way.
Uh, can you define it?
Gender dysphoria or like a delusional disorder.
Gender dysphoria.
So gender dysphoria is it refers to a, I guess if you're talking about specifically within like, the DSM-5, it would refer to clinically significant distress related to an internal incongruence between one's perceived gender identity and the sex in which they were assigned at birth. Now, in particular, clinically significant distress can be a pretty high margin to reach. Now, I think that colloquially, gender dysphoria is often more so used in a lot of ways to refer to like smaller distressors that are not clinically significant. And I think that especially in the types of gender dysphoria we talk about that are not clinically significant, I think that there are lots of cis people that kind of experience that too, like older men that like get like hair transplants, or like women that get like face surgery. They really do these to affirm their sense of their gender. So like I would say that like this kind of like a milder gender dysphoria, such that it's not clinically significant, is not in any way exclusive to trans people. Being uncomfortable with yourself or your body to an extent is pretty normal. And if people want to change that and it makes them feel better, I say power to them.
Hmm. Hmm. Um,
But were you trying to insinuate that gender dysphoria was a delusional disorder like body dysmorphia?
is one delusional and one's not?
So a delusional disorder would be one in which somebody has a false belief about themselves, and they're unable to recognize that it is a false belief. And what we know clinically is that delusional disorders respond to antipsychotic medication and delusional correcting therapy. Actually, in the 80s and 90s, doctors had this hypothesis about trans people, and they tried to treat gender dysphoria with antipsychotic medication and with delusional correcting therapy. And what they found is that it didn't work because trans people weren't delusional. They didn't have a false belief about themselves. In fact, they were starkly aware of the ways in which their biological sex differed than, what the sex characteristics they desired. And they were starkly aware of the ways in which they were perceived and treated by others was different than how they would like to be perceived and treated by others. There's no false belief about themselves. Simply, they are aware of a discomfort based in a true reality.
They're aware of a discomfort based in their true reality. But
Yeah.
that discomfort is based on how like that their physical body does not match how they mentally feel.
No, it's based on how their physical body does not match how they would like their physical body to be.
Okay. What was your biggest? Did you watch What Is a Woman? And what was your biggest kind of issue with it? The whole thing.
Um, well, it just didn't have like facts in it. It was just propagandizing, and it was extremely deceptive. I mean, you can see how much Matt like cuts between different camera angles. He is clipping every single time he cuts between a different camera angle. It is extremely deceptive. He's just trying to get gotcha moments and create propaganda. And I mean, we know how much he allows people to lie in that documentary. I mean, I did a 7-part series exposing explicit lies. Like these aren't even things that like are insinuated lies. These were objectively false, explicit lies.
So that one person who I believe is a trans man who was like really distraught, and they say that like they have very significant like health issues. Was that person lying?
He certainly lied when he said that. Oh, he definitely lied about puberty blockers in terms of like them like not being like studied. Like he did lie about that, but I mean, I certainly believe that like he had a complication, and I think that that's I don't think he was lying about his own complication, but I do think that he was certainly lying about like puberty blockers in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um. So
Oh, actually, I remember the specific lie he told. He said that Lupron, which was the maker of the most commonly prescribed puberty blocker, he said that Lupron was sued because it was like dangerous and like, it was giving people these awful side effects. That's not true. Lupron was sued because they engaged in market manipulation, not due to anything related to Lupron safety. He lied about that.
hmm. And you're sure there was no side effects to Lupron?
Well, every medicine has side effects. However, the lawsuit which he was referring was due to market manipulation. The lawsuit did not raise any concerns of safety. These types of puberty blockers have been used for over 3 decades, and there have not been any like validated complaints due to poor side effects.
Okay. Well, thank you for explaining all that. I think I just kind of like send a cautionary message to like putting too much faith in some of these studies, because as I said, there's like a big profit incentive for these pharmaceutical companies to push this.
I mean, you can look
Um,
at the data yourself. I think that your attempts to disparage these studies are entirely conspiratorial.
I just think that, a lot of people have a very naive worldview, and they'd like to think that there aren't like evil people out there who will do anything to make more money. And I think that that's real. I think there are evil people out there who would do anything to just make a boatload of cash. And I think the pharmaceutical industry is actually guilty of
Well,
this
I
in the past.
agree, and that's why I think it's important to look at the actual data that's in these studies. I mean, these studies do have to
Yeah,
go through
but
the peer
it's
review process.
don't you think
Um,
it's naive to think that there can't be some manipulation to studies? As I mentioned, there like studies have been manipulated in the past, especially when there's a massive profit incentive.
so I want to be clear, these kind of studies in the past, it was more so deceptive in the types of things they researched. For example, with like cigarettes, essentially what the cigarette companies would do is they would try to sponsor their own research into investigating whether random things could like have any kind of impact on like cancer rates and stuff. And they essentially what they would find is inconclusive results. And then they would use this to say, oh, like all this kind of like fear mongering about like cancer rates, it's inconclusive. So stop worrying about these studies which were coming out, which were showing that cigarettes were linked to cancer rates and those kind of things. Even back then, the studies were showing that like cigarettes were definitely linked to harmful outcomes. What they tried to do was they tried to disparage those by launching tangential studies on unrelated topics, which had inconclusive results, to try to paint research as a whole as inconclusive.
How do you know that's not happening right now with the studies that you're putting a lot of faith in? How do you know that those studies aren't to debunk the actual real research that does say that there is detrimental effects to long-term hormone use, for example? Like, how do you know for sure? Because it is new, right?
Well, essentially, I look at the data and I look at the studies themselves. Like you can read these studies and review their methodology. And I mean, these are studies which are done by universities. The types of studies which were done to disparage research were done specifically by think tanks and by these businesses themselves. So I would say look at the peer-reviewed research which is coming out of universities, because these universities are publicly funded, and they often operate they do operate entirely independently from the pharmaceutical companies. If anything, they might get some funding, but that has no impact on the types of problems and the types of research they're able to engage in. So yeah, look at the peer-reviewed
Right.
studies coming out of universities, not the kind of things which are coming out of think tanks and like corporate conglomerates.
Right. Call me cynical. I do not have that much faith in the academic institutions anymore.
Why
So it's,
not?
oh, it's peer reviewed, and it's like, okay, like I hope that's like what do you call it? Airtight. Because there's a lot riding on this, there's a lot riding on this.
Well, I do want to be clear. I don't think that like an individual peer-reviewed study is completely airtight, but that's why what's really important is looking at broader trends, looking at systematic literature reviews, looking at meta-analyses. Essentially, what we want to do is you want to look at giant collections and meta-analyses of studies, because you can identify broader trends in these meta-analyses, in these systematic literature reviews. Every study is going to have weaknesses and shortcomings, but when we have a giant collection of studies, the strengths of certain studies will overcome the weaknesses of other studies. For example, we have a giant collection of studies. Maybe, say, study A didn't have a control group. Oh, but study B did. Maybe study C had a smaller sample size, but study D had a larger sample size. Study E could have had a potential confounding factor, but study F accounted for that. And yet all of these studies find the same general trend. We can know that, well, all of these confounding factors are accounted for by other studies, and the general trend seems to hold in all of these different circumstances. It provides validation. And when we look at the meta-analyses on trans people, there was a giant systematic literature review done by Cornell University. They identified 56 studies that assessed the mental health and overall well-being effect of gender transition on trans people. And 52 of those 56 studies found that there was a positive effect on the mental health and overall well-being of trans people. 4 studies indicated mixed or neutral results, and 0 studies indicated negative results. So when we look at the meta-analyses where we can account for these weaknesses, the trends are overwhelmingly clear.
Hmm. Okay, one last question before I go. Do you think there is any trend between like trans women and um, like mentally ill sociopathic behavior?
Sociopathic behavior, I have not seen any kind of like empirical evidence on that. But we do know that any kind of like oppressed minority which faces social ostracization does have poor mental health outcomes on average. I mean, like we mentioned, trans people have higher unaliving rates, higher rates of depression and anxiety. I do not have any empirical evidence with regards to like sociopathic tendencies.
Hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasant conversation. If you do want to hear more about some of the stuff that I was talking about, I think a good website is redux.info. RED red
Wait, you do know that like
UXX.
Redux intentionally spreads misinformation, right?
Where's your evidence of that?
Um, there was so they're like known for like spreading lots of misinformation and like outright lying about topics. It's founded by like two people whose sole goal is to defame and discredit trans people. There's a YouTuber Jesse Gender who did a recent video going over the Redux article on Eli Ehrlich and exposing how it is full of misinformation and lies, which are designed to intentionally paint, Eli as harmful and dangerous in ways that are just simply factually incorrect.
So there may have been one article where they got it wrong, but like they kind of constantly report on this stuff, kind of talking about transgender predators or
They
people who are kind of.
constantly get things wrong. No, like seriously, I encourage you, try to fact check these articles. They are consistent liars.
I mean, I hope you're right, but once again, it's like I don't know why. Like there just seems to be no sort of like caution on your part. It's kind of like, no, like these hormones are great. Teaching kids about this is great. Like you don't think there's any dangers
Oh,
here? Like
I'm
you're
certainly
downplaying
cautious of,
the.
of things like harmful misinformation, things that like Redux is guilty of.
No, but I mean, to kind of promote transgenderism as if there isn't dangers or consequences, like you kind of just hand waved away the whole detransitioning thing. Um,
Not
when
hand
in
waving at all. I would certainly hope that we would live in a society that is accepting of trans and gender nonconforming people, such that detransitioners receive the exact same level of respect and access to the resources they need as trans people. But if you want to talk about like what are the broader trends, what we know is that gender transition is the effective treatment to improve the mental health and overall well-being of trans people. Every other treatment we've tried just doesn't work. And, trans people do exist. They're going to exist. And I think it's important that trans people do have access to these resources that are the things they need, that are the things that are going to help them.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
here's a good question. Let's say there's somebody who is questioning their 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 biological what they were biologically born with, and they're like, you know what, maybe I want to switch. And let's say, for sake of like making it a hard decision, let's say they're like 9 or 10. Would you suggest that like they wait to go through puberty first, or would you suggest they kind of like look for gender affirming care?
I would suggest they talk to a gender therapist to figure out, why do they feel this way and what is right for them. And, if through years of gender therapy, it is determined that puberty blockers would be a good thing for them, then I would think that it would be good for them to take those puberty blockers and to continue going to gender therapy. But if at any point, through gender therapy, they realize, I think I was just, struggling a little bit. I think I'm just gender nonconforming. That's a-okay. Then they just resume their puberty like normal if they were on the puberty blockers, or if they, never even got on the puberty blockers because, once again, years of gender therapy are required, then that's okay too.
Did you do the gender therapy?
No, I did not. I transitioned as an adult.
Okay. I'm really curious what transgender therapy would look like for kids. Like that's kind of mind blowing to me. It's like you're gonna have like a 9, 10-year-old and ask them about, hey, how do you feel about being a boy? I know you're only like 9, but how,
I do know someone that has gone through that kind of gender therapy around like early teen years. I'm sure you could look for like personal accounts, but it is more of like an exploratory kind of process. It's less of a like we're going to just like tell you. It's certainly not we're going to tell you who you are. It's much more
I hope
so.
not.
Let's explore. What are you feeling? Why are you feeling this? What is right for you? Why do you think that's right for you?
Hmm. And is all this kind of new? Is this not all kind of new, like gender therapy for kids? Like this is a pretty new thing, is it not?
I mean, there have certainly been types of therapies like geared towards gender nonconforming people for quite a while. And I mean, like research specifically on like medical transition predates to like early 1900s, like Weimar Germany. But I mean, like as far as like social transition type stuff, trans people have existed, throughout all of human cultures, throughout all of human societies for, thousands and thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, but like it wasn't really common. Like once again, it was a minority throughout history. Like it wasn't really
Yeah, so what?
yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that's gonna change, I guess.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that trans people are going to become a majority. But,
Right.
they still deserve, equal social acceptance.
Sure. Um, so real quick, how many different genders are there? Where are you on that question?
So I would say that, like, are you talking about, like, gender identity?
Um,
Like, what type of
I-
gender are you talking about in particular?
there's different types of gender?
Well, I mean, when you're referring to gender, are you referring to biological sex? Are you referring to gender identity? Are you referring to like social gender? Like what specific type of gender are you referring to?
Wow. So there's sexual gender, there's social gender, and there's another type of gender. There's three different types of
So
gender
what I'm talking
categories.
about is how when people colloquially use the term gender, they often use it interchangeably when they're referring to gender identity, when they're referring to gender roles, and when they're referring to biological sex. When you're asking me how many genders are there, do you want to know how many gender identities are there, how many gender roles are there, or how many biological sexes are there?
Um, well, it's good to, I think it's a good distinction that, like, I feel that there's just one thing. I think there's biological sex. I think gender itself has just kind of been this word that was invented 80 years ago, and it was invented in like more of the social sciences than anything else, where it really kind of picked up steam. Um, and I think
Yeah,
it's kind
because we
of
started recognizing that there are lots of social aspects of gender which are very arbitrary in nature and which have nothing to do with biological sex. That's why this idea originated from the social sciences. But if you're talking about how many biological sexes are there, I would say that biological sex exists bimodally distributed along a spectrum, and that is the most accurately way to describe how many biological sexes there are.
right. So it's mainly two, but there's a little sliver in between
You
of
could say it goes
intersex.
roughly in two directions. Sure.
Okay. Um, I so how many genders are there? I guess you
Gender
answered that
roles
with
or gender
another.
identities?
Well, gender roles is just like a male and female, masculine, feminine, right?
Well, it would be dependent on the society in which you're referring to. If we were talking about, say, like traditional Jewish societies, the answer would be six. If we're talking about a lot of Native American cultures, the answer would be three. If we're talking about like a lot of more Western societies, the answer would be mostly two. It depends on the society and the culture you're referring to.
Right, right. And that's kind of speaks to why I don't know. I think gender is just such a flimsy term. Like I think most of this conversation we've been talking about the biological realities, and then when it comes to trans people, it's more of like a and also there's a mental dimension to it as well. And like why I really don't like messing with the word gender is it turns into like a sociology anthropological sort of analysis of culture and stuff. And it's not to like, it's not to say that it's not valid, but I guess it's easy to kind of just continue to dance around and write essays and essays about it. And it's interesting, but that's
Well, I
why I
think
kind
they're
of like
both
to
worth examining, and if you are strictly interested in biological realities, I mean, there are many ways in which trans people are biologically the sex they transition to, provided they medically transition. And specifically, I mean, if you're
no.
really thinking that gender is like strictly biological, what would matter most for who someone is would have to be their neurobiology, right?
Okay, you make a point with the neurobiology, sure, but like
And
I'm
trans people's
sorry.
neurobiology is more in line with the gender they transition to than the gender they were assigned at birth, even before they medically transition. We know that there are these complex hormonal genetic influences that happen in the womb, which affect trans people's neurobiology. And we could certainly define biological sex in terms of neurobiology, such that it would include trans people.
I'm honestly distracted because you said you sneaked in there that yeah, like people can biologically transition and they have like the genitals of the opposite sex that they were born with. I I do not. I'm not on board with that idea at all. I
So
don't think that's
that's
real
what
at all.
bottom surgery is. But more broadly, when you take cross sex hormones, that absolutely changes your hormonal sex and it changes overwhelmingly most aspects of your anatomical sex as well. For example, the reason why female people have higher rates of breast cancer than male people is because they have breast tissue. And if you medically transition in the male to female direction, you develop breasts which are anatomically identical to cis females, and you actually trans women and cis women have identical rates of breast cancer because their breasts are biologically identical.
Well, it's because of the hormones that they're taking, right?
Exactly. This is an aspect of your biological sex which you can change.
Sure,
Most
but
of your
I don't see
biological sex,
why,
most of
like,
these sex characteristics are malleable.
right, but why kind of overcomplicate it? It's like you're taking hormones. That's the difference. You know, like that's what's it's the hormone of estrogen or it's the hormone of testosterone. Like this is the thing that we're adding to the environment.
I'm not overcomplicating
Um,
anything. I'm simply explaining the biological reality of trans people.
sure. Well, when it comes to the bottom surgery, though, I don't think that's a pretty hot take on your part to say, hey, like you can actually change your male organ into a female organ. Like that's not,
Well,
you don't
you do
actually
know that
believe
like
that.
you do know that male and female genitals are both made from the exact same tissues. It's simply due to hormonal washes in the womb, which cause them to those exact same tissues to develop in one direction or another. And through hormone therapy and bottom surgery, you simply rearrange the tissues such that they are functional as the other genitals.
Like they're maybe sort of technically functional. I would maybe give you that, but I think calling what is it like a neo male organ and a neo female organ, like calling that an original male organ or an original female organ, like I don't think you're gonna get anyone who's gonna like, yeah,
I
they're
didn't call it
exactly the same.
original. I simply said that you can change your genitals through bottom surgery, which by the using the
I
terms neo, we are
See,
recognizing that they are changed.
you're not gonna like this, but I think the word is mutilate. I don't think it's change your genitals. I think you're mutilating yourself at that point.
What would you define mutilation as?
I don't know. Let's look up mutilation. I'm like it's probably
Well, I'm
not a
asking
good
what you believe.
definition. Mutilate, inflict a violent and disfiguring injury.
Okay. Do you think that it's violent and disfiguring?
I mean, I would explain what has to happen for a trans woman to get bottom surgery, but I'd spare you the details because I personally, being an owner of a male organ, it sounds horrific. It
So
sounds, I don't
you
know
could
why anyone would want to
fearmonger.
go through that.
You could fearmonger about literally any surgery like this. I mean, surgeries in general are they're just kind of scary if you look at like the procedures done live. I mean, like open heart surgery, one could describe it as
Okay,
violent and disfiguring, but it helps people, and that's why it's a good thing to do. And
isn't the
bottom
difference
surgery
though,
helps people.
isn't the difference though that like, you know, hopefully when a surgery goes well, it's not infected, there's no longer ongoing maintenance. Is there not a thing with trans women where they kind of have to constantly like maintain their
You're
new,
talking about dilation.
yeah,
So essentially, you do have to dilate for, I believe it's like the first year or so. But then afterwards, if you are using it regularly, you actually don't have to dilate. And there
but
are plenty of
just
surgeries which do require long-term maintenance. This is just sometimes a fact about surgery. Sometimes surgeries do require some maintenance and upkeep.
right, but just to kind of score my points in this debate here, it's like if you're a regular woman, you don't need to do that type of maintenance. You don't have to do dilation maintenance, right?
There are actually cisgender women that are born with deformed
Again,
genitals that receive these
this is
kinds of
an
surgeries
exception. This
that
is an
then do
exception though.
require dilation. So even if you're talking about,
You can't keep taking these statistical anomalies and then say, yeah, and therefore all women are like this. Like, no, this
I'm
is
not
like
saying all women are like that. I'm just saying that there are cases where even cisgender women have to do this as well.
yeah,
It
very,
doesn't
very rare
exclude them from
cases.
womanhood by any means, and it's just simply a necessary part of some surgeries that they require some upkeep for a period of time, and that's okay. If the surgery helps people overwhelmingly so, that's still a good thing.
Um, is like, are you leaving anything out here? Like, are because like, you know, what about the trans men? Like, I feel I would suspect rather that there's a lot of complications that trans men or trans women might run into when they get bottom surgery down the road. Maybe it's a week after surgery, maybe it's like years. Like, are you being honest here? Like, is there not
So, I
like
mean,
complications that do
there
come
there
up?
are
How
plenty of
common does it come
surgeries
up?
there are plenty of surgeries that do have, higher complication rates, but I think the most important metric to analyze these by are the regret rates or like the satisfaction rates of the surgery. And it's actually true that every elective surgery has a regret rate, or it has a rate at which people, are dissatisfied with the results. But with in terms of bottom surgery and in terms of all gender affirming surgeries, the regret rates of these purely elective surgeries are far lower than the regret rates of most elective surgeries. I know that like LASIK eye surgery has a regret rate of about 4%. And in terms of gender affirming
Study.
surgery, there was a systematic literature review of 27 peer reviewed studies covering a total of 7,928 trans individuals. And it found that the total regret rate of gender affirming surgeries was just 1%.
Uh, that's interesting. That's
That's
interesting.
like one fourth the regret rate of LASIK eye surgery.
Well, I'd like to see how soon after they asked about that. And
I have I know that one of these studies was a 50-year longitudinal study, so it followed people for 50 years.
mhm,
So, I mean, these are extremely long term.
50 years.
Yeah,
It's almost as old as the word gender. Um,
science is
okay.
cool, right?
I think science can be manipulated by big pharma, and I think that's something that people need to be aware of.
My dude, you're gonna have to provide some evidence for this conspiracy. Like, these claims are entirely conspiratorial and completely unfalsifiable. They don't bring anything to this kind of conversation or debate.
I think it's just kind of, I think it's just sort of like an instinct thing. I think it's just kind of like a common sense thing. You can believe that big pharma isn't going to try to make as much money as possible by getting people on hormones for the rest of their life, and it's like it'd be probably
So,
interesting to see
I
how much
I
money that
simultaneously
trans the
believe
transgen. It'd be
I
interesting to see how
simultaneously
much.
believe that big pharma is predatory and that they, will try to do awful things to make a profit, like they did with, price gouging insulin, like they do with the opioid epidemic, while simultaneously believing that peer-reviewed academic research is overwhelmingly very well vetted and conducted by public universities, which are free from corporate influence because these universities are publicly funded.
Yeah,
Those are not mutually exclusive by any means.
yeah. I mean, I think it sounds nice to believe that they have our best interest in mind and all that, but
I
I
have
just be
never
wary.
once
I just
claimed
be
that
wor
big pharma has our best interest in mind. My point is that academic research is overwhelmingly untainted.
Yeah, I don't agree with that either.
Like
Um,
you think that peer-reviewed research is overwhelmingly tainted? Like the kind of stuff that comes out of public universities?
I wouldn't say all of it, but I wouldn't say just because it's peer reviewed, you can put your all of your faith in it. And
Right. I'm saying it's
yeah.
overwhelmingly untainted, which is why I look at the systematic literature reviews, why I look at the meta-analyses, because, if we have research that, say peer-reviewed research is 99% very good. If we can look
Hmm.
at the broader trends that we see in systematic literature reviews and in meta-analyses, then,
Hmm.
it is basically impossible for all of those studies to be the bad 1%, right?
Yeah. Speaking of studies, is there been is it true that there's like a link between transgenderism and childhood trauma?
Not to my knowledge. I have never seen any study which has actually like found any kind of like statistically significant correlation between that.
Okay. If there was a study that said there was a connection, would you believe it, or like how much kind of uh like would you look into it at all, or
Sure, I'd certainly look into it. Although simply because something happens due to trauma does not mean that we shouldn't, try to treat it the best we can. And even if it was the case that, like trauma was making people, transgender, I would still think that we should try to treat transgender people the best we can and to help them, with like social acceptance, with, medical resources to the best extent we can.
awesome. Yo, it's been a slice. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all the bits or whatever, guys. And yeah, glad we could be civil during all that.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on my live.
Yeah, no problem. And you can check out my the TikTok I did about the trans thing and kids a moment ago. But yeah, thanks for having me. Bye.
All right. You have a nice night.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.
All right, that was an interesting conversation. I think that overall that was really good to look into. I just like I think my biggest point of contention is that the conspiratorial claims about like academia and research were just completely unfounded. And I hope that I can push Greg a little bit further on that because like once again I am not claiming that peer review is some kind of perfect process, but rather it's a overwhelmingly very good process, and that when we look at the systematic literature reviews, when we look at the meta-analyses, that's the kind of stuff we can trust because the strengths and the generally overwhelmingly positive and effectiveness of the peer review will overcome the weaknesses of the poorly done studies. It will overcome the weaknesses of perhaps that rare bad study that's out there. And there are examples of bad studies that are out there that have passed peer review, but once again, that's why we want to look at the broader trends in research, and that's why I specifically try to refer to systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses whenever I can. Yeah.